What if I told you that in 1844, Mississippi, a young enslaved man became the most feared name among the Southern elite? That beauty could be the deadliest weapon of all. If you think you know how power works, think again. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, share this incredible story, and comment below where you're watching from, because this tale will change everything you thought you knew about survival and revenge. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Caleb, and this is the story of how I turned my chains into weapons. I was born in 1826 on Arbordale Plantation, nestled deep in the heart of Mississippi, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the scorching sun. From my earliest memories, I knew I was different, not just because of the circumstances of my birth. My mother, Sarah, was the plantation's seamstress, and my father, well, that was a secret that would shape my entire existence. The other enslaved children would stare at me with a mixture of curiosity and unease. My skin was lighter than most, my features sharper, and my eyes held an unusual green tint that seemed to catch the light in ways that made people uncomfortable. But it wasn't just my appearance that set me apart. It was the way I watched, listened, and learned. Master Edmund Whitmore owned Arbordale, and his wife Constance ruled the household with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She was a woman who understood power, and from the age of 10, I noticed how her gaze would linger on me during the morning inspections. There was something calculating in her eyes, something that made my skin crawl even as I kept my expression carefully neutral. "That boy," I heard her whisper to her friend Mrs. Beaumont one afternoon as I served tea on the veranda. "There's something about him. He's going to be trouble when he grows up." Mrs. Beaumont, a plump woman with kind eyes but a weak constitution, glanced at me nervously. "Perhaps you should sell him before then, Constance. Some things are better dealt with early." But Constance Whitmore was not a woman who ran from potential problems. She collected them, studied them, and found ways to use them to her advantage. "No," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant her mind was made up. "I think young Caleb here might prove quite useful in the right circumstances." I was 12 when I first understood what she meant. The Whitmore family frequently hosted gatherings for the local elite, plantation owners, politicians, judges, and their families. These events were opportunities for the powerful to consolidate their influence, arrange marriages, and make deals that would shape the region's future. And I, with my unusual appearance and quick mind, became a curiosity that drew attention. "Constance, wherever did you find such an interesting specimen?" asked Judge Harrison's wife, Margaret, during one particularly lavish dinner party. She was a woman in her 40s with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. "He's quite striking." I stood perfectly still as they discussed me like a piece of fine china, my hands clasped behind my back, my expression blank. But inside, I was cataloguing every word, every glance, every subtle shift in power dynamics that played out before me. "Oh, Caleb has been with us since birth," Constance replied smoothly. "Haven't you, dear boy?" "Yes, Ma'am," I responded, my voice carefully modulated to show respect without subservience. Even then, I understood the delicate balance required to survive in their world. Margaret Harrison leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. "And I suppose he's been educated. He seems quite aware." This was dangerous territory. Educated slaves were viewed with suspicion, seen as potential threats to the established order. But Constance had always been clever about such things. "Just enough to be useful," she said with a dismissive wave. "He can read and write basic instructions, nothing more. Though I must say, he has a remarkable memory for faces and conversations." The way she said it made my blood run cold. I realized then that I wasn't just a slave to be worked in the fields or the house. I was being groomed for something else entirely. something that would require me to navigate the treacherous waters of southern high society while remaining invisible enough to be overlooked when convenient. As the months passed, I found myself assigned to more and more social functions. I served drinks at political gatherings, carried messages between the ladies during their afternoon teas, and stood silently in corners while the men discussed business deals that would affect thousands of lives. And I listened. I learned. I began to understand the intricate web of relationships, debts, secrets, and ambitions that held their world together. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, the young wife of a wealthy cotton merchant, had a gambling problem that she hid from her husband. Miss Eleanor Pemberton, daughter of a prominent politician, was secretly corresponding with a Union sympathizer in Boston. Mrs. Catherine Beauregard, the judge's sister-in-law, had been embezzling funds from the local church charity. Each piece of information was a potential weapon, and I stored them all away in my memory like a general preparing for war. By my 16th birthday, I had grown into the promise of my unusual features. I stood tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a face that seemed to have been carved by an artist's careful hand. The green eyes that had made people uncomfortable in my childhood now drew them in like moths to a flame, and the women began to notice. It started with lingering glances during dinner service, then progressed to requests for me to personally attend to various tasks. Mrs. Whitmore would send me to deliver messages that could have been handled by any of the house servants. Mrs. Harrison would insist that only I could properly arrange the flowers for her weekly tea parties. Miss Pemberton would find excuses to visit Arbordale more frequently, always with some urgent matter that required my assistance. I understood what was happening, and I began to plan. The first lesson my mother had taught me was that survival required adaptation. The second lesson I learned on my own. Sometimes the prey must become the predator. As I stood in the mirror of the small room I shared with two other house servants, studying my reflection by candlelight, I made a decision that would change everything. If these women wanted to use me as a pawn in their games of power and influence, then I would learn to play the game better than any of them. I would use their desires against them. I would turn their obsessions into their downfall. And I would find a way to transform my beauty from a curse into the key to my freedom. The myth of Caleb was about to be born, and Mississippi would never be the same. Tomorrow, Mrs. Constance Whitmore would make her first move in what she thought was a game she controlled. She had no idea that her beautiful, intelligent slave had already begun planning her destruction. The hunt was about to begin, and I intended to be the hunter, not the hunted. The morning of September 15th, 1844, dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the Spanish moss seem to wilt in defeat. I was polishing silver in the dining room when Mrs. Constance Whitmore summoned me to her private study, a room I had only entered a handful of times, and never alone with her. "Close the door behind you, Caleb," she instructed, not looking up from the letter she was writing at her mahogany desk. The room smelled of lavender and old money, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the morning light. I did as instructed, and stood with my hands clasped behind my back, waiting. Constance Whitmore was a woman who understood the power of silence, and she let it stretch between us until the tension became almost unbearable. Finally, she set down her pen and looked at me with those calculating blue eyes that had been studying me for years. "You're 18 now, Caleb, a man by most standards." "Yes, ma'am, and quite a handsome man at that." She rose from her chair and walked around the desk, her silk dress rustling softly. "I've been thinking about your future, about how best to utilize your particular talents." The way she said utilize made my skin crawl, but I kept my expression neutral. "I live to serve the Whitmore family, ma'am." She laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Oh, I know you do, but I think it's time we expanded your duties beyond the household." She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else, something hungry and dangerous. "There's going to be a gathering next week," she continued, circling me slowly like a predator sizing up its prey. "Governor Matthews will be attending, along with several other influential gentlemen, men who support my husband desperately needs for his political ambitions." I remained silent, though my mind was already racing ahead, trying to anticipate where this conversation was leading. "The governor has a particular weakness," Constance said, stopping directly in front of me. "He's quite fond of beautiful things. Beautiful art, beautiful horses, beautiful people." Her hand reached out and touched my cheek, her fingers cold despite the heat. "I think you could be very helpful in securing his favor." The implication hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain still. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when I would either become another victim of their twisted games or begin my transformation into something far more dangerous. "I understand, ma'am," I said quietly. "Good." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I knew you were intelligent enough to see the bigger picture. This arrangement could be quite beneficial for both of us. You helped me secure the governor's support, and I ensure your life here remains comfortable." But as she spoke, I noticed something she probably thought I couldn't see from my angle: a letter on her desk, partially hidden beneath other papers. The letterhead was unmistakable. It bore the seal of the Bank of New Orleans, and from what I could glimpse of the text, it appeared to be discussing some kind of loan arrangement that her husband knew nothing about. Constance Whitmore was playing a much larger game than even I had suspected. "When would you like me to begin preparing for this service?" I asked, injecting just enough resignation into my voice to make her believe she had won. "The gathering is in 5 days. "That should give us plenty of time to discuss the details." She returned to her desk, already dismissing me in her mind. "You may go. And Caleb? Not a word of this to anyone. I trust you understand the consequences of indiscretion." "Of course, ma'am." I left her study with my mind spinning, but not with fear, with opportunity. Constance Whitmore had just made her first mistake. She had underestimated me. That evening, I volunteered to help with the late-night cleaning of the study, something I had never done before. The other house servants were too tired to question my sudden enthusiasm for extra work. While they focused on the main areas, I carefully made my way to Constance's desk. The letter from the Bank of New Orleans was even more damning than I had hoped. Mrs. Whitmore had taken out a substantial loan using the plantation as collateral, but the paperwork indicated that her husband's signature had been forged. She was using the money to fund her own political maneuvering, including bribes to secure favorable legislation for a cotton export business she was secretly developing. But the most interesting detail was a reference to her correspondence with a certain Mr. James Morrison in Charleston, a man I recognized as a known abolitionist sympathizer. Constance Whitmore, pillar of Southern society and slave owner, was secretly selling information about local plantation security to someone who was likely involved in the Underground Railroad. The irony was delicious. She was betraying her own class while simultaneously trying to use me as a pawn in her political games. I carefully memorized every detail of the letter, then returned it to its exact position. Over the next 3 days, I gathered more information, listening carefully to conversations and observing the patterns of correspondence that flowed through the household. By the time the gathering arrived, I had a complete picture of Constance Whitmore's web of deception. The evening of the party, I was dressed in the finest clothes the plantation could provide. A crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and a jacket that had been tailored to show off my physique. I looked the part of an exotic ornament, exactly as Constance intended. Governor Matthews arrived with his entourage just after sunset, a portly man with thinning hair and eyes that immediately began cataloguing everything of value in the room, including me. "Constance, my dear," he said, kissing her hand with exaggerated gallantry. "Your hospitality is legendary, as always." "Governor, you flatter me," she replied, then gestured toward me. I'd like you to meet Caleb. He'll be attending to your needs this evening." The governor's eyes lit up with unmistakable interest. "How thoughtful of you." As the evening progressed, I played my role perfectly. I served drinks, engaged in carefully scripted conversation, and allowed the governor to believe that I was nothing more than an attractive servant who could be easily manipulated. All the while, I waited for the perfect moment. It came when Constance excused herself to powder her nose, leaving me alone with the governor and two of his associates in the study. "You know," Governor Matthews said, his words slightly slurred from whiskey, "your mistress is quite the remarkable woman. Very forward-thinking in her business ventures." His associates chuckled knowingly, and I realized they were all aware of her secret dealings. "She certainly is resourceful," I agreed, then paused as if uncertain whether I should continue. "Though I sometimes worry about her correspondence with that gentleman in Charleston." The governor's expression sharpened immediately. "What correspondence?" I feigned nervousness, glancing toward the door. "I probably shouldn't say anything. It's just that I sometimes deliver her letters, and I couldn't help but notice, well, the name Morrison appears quite frequently." The effect was immediate and devastating. Governor Matthews went pale, and his associates exchanged alarmed glances. James Morrison was a known abolitionist whose activities were being closely monitored by Southern authorities. Any association with him would be political suicide. "Are you certain of this?" the governor demanded. I nodded reluctantly, as if I was betraying a confidence against my better judgment. "I've seen the letters myself, sir, and there was mention of plantation security arrangements, information about patrol schedules." I didn't need to say more. The governor's political mind was already racing ahead, calculating the implications. If Constance Whitmore was feeding information to abolitionists, then anyone associated with her would be tainted by suspicion. When Constance returned to the study 20 minutes later, she found the governor and his party preparing to leave abruptly. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. "I'm afraid urgent business has arisen," the governor replied coldly. "Thank you for your hospitality." As the door closed behind them, Constance turned to me with fury blazing in her eyes. "What did you say to them?" "Nothing, Mom," I replied innocently. "We only discussed the weather and the cotton harvest." But I could see in her expression that she knew something had gone terribly wrong. Over the next few days, the consequences became clear. The governor not only withdrew his support for her husband's political ambitions, but began actively working against them. Word spread through the political circles that the Whitmore family was not to be trusted. Within a week, Constance's secret loan was called in by the bank. Her correspondence with Morrison was exposed to local authorities, and her husband discovered her forged signature. The woman who had tried to use me as a pawn in her political games found herself completely destroyed by the very secrets she thought she controlled. As I watched her pack her belongings before being sent away to live with distant relatives in disgrace, I felt no satisfaction, only a cold sense of justice served. 1 down, 7 to go. The myth of Caleb was no longer just beginning, it was becoming reality. With Constance Whitmore's dramatic fall from grace, the social landscape of Mississippi's elite had shifted like sand in a storm. Her disgrace created a power vacuum that two young heiresses were eager to fill, and both had set their sights on me as the key to their ambitions. Miss Victoria Ashford, 22 years old and heir to the largest cotton export fortune in 3 counties, had skin like porcelain and ambition like steel. Her rival, Miss Eleanor Pemberton, daughter of Senator Pemberton and only 20, possessed a sharp intellect that she wielded like a blade behind her sweet Southern belle facade. The irony wasn't lost on me that these two women, who should have been natural allies in their social circle, had become bitter enemies over the question of who would control the beautiful slave boy who had somehow brought down the formidable Constance Whitmore. It was Miss Ashford who made the first move. "Caleb," she said one afternoon as I served tea at her family's mansion during one of her elaborate social gatherings, "I've been thinking about your situation since poor Mrs. Whitmore's difficulties." I kept my expression carefully neutral as I poured her tea, though every instinct told me to be wary. Victoria Ashford was known for her calculating nature and her ability to destroy rivals with surgical precision. "I'm quite content in my current position, Miss Ashford," I replied respectfully. She laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be both beautiful and threatening. "Oh, I'm sure you are, but I think we both know that your talents are being wasted at Arbordale. A young man of your particular gifts could accomplish so much more with the right patronage." The other ladies at the tea party, wives and daughters of prominent families, watched our exchange with barely concealed fascination. I realized that this conversation was as much a performance for them as it was a proposition for me. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Ashford?" I asked, though I already suspected where this was leading. "I'm suggesting that you could be of great service to someone who truly appreciates your value," she said, her blue eyes never leaving mine. "Someone who could ensure your future is secure." Before I could respond, the parlor door opened and Miss Eleanor Pemberton swept in, her timing so perfect it could only have been planned. "Victoria, darling," Eleanor said with a smile that could have cut glass. "How lovely to see you. And Caleb, what a pleasant surprise." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the two young women faced each other. The other ladies sensed the tension and leaned forward slightly, like spectators at a gladiatorial match. "Eleanor," Victoria replied with matching false sweetness, "I wasn't expecting you today." "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to discuss the charity auction next week," Eleanor said, settling herself gracefully into a chair. "I do hope you'll be contributing something substantial." The verbal sparring continued for several minutes, each woman landing subtle insults disguised as compliments, while I stood silently between them, understanding that I was somehow the prize they were fighting over. It was Eleanor who finally made her intentions clear. "Caleb," she said, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I wonder if you might escort me to my carriage. I have something I'd like to discuss with you privately." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure whatever you need to say can be said here among friends." "Oh, but it's such a delicate matter," Eleanor replied with mock concern. "I wouldn't want to burden everyone with the details." "Indeed." As we walked to her carriage, Eleanor's mask of southern politeness slipped slightly. "That woman thinks she can buy anything she wants," she said, with venom in her voice. "But some things aren't for sale." "And what would those things be, Miss Pemberton?" I asked carefully. She stopped walking and turned to face me, her dark eyes intense. "Loyalty. True loyalty. The kind that comes from mutual respect rather than financial obligation." I was beginning to understand the game these two women were playing. They weren't just competing for control over me, they were using me as a symbol in their larger rivalry for social dominance. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare," I said diplomatically, "but I'm not sure I understand what you're offering." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "I'm offering you a chance to be more than just a servant, Caleb. My father has connections throughout the South. With the right word from me, you could find yourself in a position of real influence." The proposition was tempting, but I had learned from Constance Whitmore's mistake. These women saw me as a tool to be used, not a person to be respected. And tools, no matter how valuable, were ultimately disposable. Over the next few weeks, both Victoria and Eleanor escalated their campaigns to win my allegiance. Victoria sent expensive gifts, books, clothing, even a gold pocket watch that must have cost more than most slaves saw in a lifetime. Eleanor, meanwhile, arranged for me to attend exclusive social events where I could observe the political machinations of the state's most powerful men. But as I watched their rivalry intensify, I began to see an opportunity that neither of them had anticipated. Both women had secrets that they thought were safely hidden. Victoria's gambling debts were far worse than anyone suspected. She had been embezzling money from her father's business to cover her losses. Eleanor, meanwhile, was secretly engaged to a young man from Boston whose abolitionist sympathies would destroy her father's political career if they became known. More importantly, I discovered that their rivalry had deeper roots than mere competition over me. Years earlier, they had been close friends until a scandal involving a young man named Thomas Beaumont had torn them apart. Each blamed the other for his death in a duel, and their current conflict was as much about old wounds as new ambitions. I decided to use their history against them. The opportunity came during the annual Harvest Ball, the most important social event of the season. Both women would be in attendance, along with most of the region's elite. I had been assigned to serve at the event, which would give me access to conversations and private moments that could prove crucial. The evening of the ball, I made sure to be visible to both Victoria and Eleanor, playing the role of the coveted prize they were both pursuing. But I also began planting carefully crafted seeds of suspicion. To Victoria, I mentioned overhearing Eleanor discussing old debts that needed to be settled with a gentleman from Boston. To Eleanor, I suggested that Victoria had been asking pointed questions about her father's political positions on certain sensitive issues. As the evening progressed, I watched their paranoia grow. Each woman began to see threats and conspiracies in the other's every action. When Victoria complimented Eleanor's dress, Eleanor heard mockery. When Eleanor asked about Victoria's father's business, Victoria suspected espionage. The breaking point came when I arranged for both women to overhear a carefully staged conversation between myself and another servant. I made sure they heard me discussing a letter that supposedly contained damaging information about the Beaumont affair. Information that could destroy both their reputations if it became public. The effect was immediate and devastating. Both women assumed that the other possessed this fictional letter and was planning to use it as a weapon. Their rivalry, which had been conducted with the veneer of Southern politeness, exploded into open warfare. Victoria accused Eleanor of blackmail during the middle of the ball's main dance. Eleanor responded by revealing Victoria's gambling debts to a room full of their peers. The confrontation escalated until both women were screaming accusations at each other, while the cream of Mississippi society watched in horrified fascination. By the end of the evening, both Victoria Ashford and Eleanor Pemberton had destroyed each other's reputations so thoroughly that neither would ever recover their former social standing. Victoria's father disowned her when the extent of her debts became known, while Eleanor's engagement to the Boston abolitionist was exposed, ending her father's political career. As I cleaned up the aftermath of the ball, I reflected on how easily their own ambitions and insecurities had been turned against them. They had seen me as a prize to be won, never realizing that the prize was actually the hunter. 2 down, 5 to go. But I knew that the remaining women would be more dangerous, more cunning, and far less likely to underestimate the beautiful slave who had somehow managed to destroy 3 of the most powerful women in Mississippi. The game was becoming more complex, and the stakes were rising with each victory, but I was no longer the frightened boy who had polished silver in Constance Whitmore's dining room. I was becoming something else entirely, something that the elite of the South were only beginning to fear. The myth was growing, and soon it would become a legend that would outlive us all. The autumn of 1844 brought with it a new player to our deadly game, one whose arrival I should have anticipated but somehow hadn't fully prepared for. Mrs. Evangeline Hartwell, 35 years old and recently widowed, had come to establish the first formal academy for young ladies in our county. She was educated, sophisticated, and possessed a dangerous combination of intelligence and moral flexibility that made her far more formidable than the previous women I had faced. Unlike Victoria and Eleanor, who had been driven by social ambition and petty rivalry, Evangeline Hartwell was motivated by something far more complex. a genuine belief that she was civilizing the wilderness of Mississippi society, even if it meant bending a few rules along the way. I first encountered her during a reception at Judge Harrison's mansion, where she was being introduced to local society as the new headmistress of the Magnolia Academy for Young Ladies. She was tall and elegant, with prematurely grey hair that she wore in an elaborate style that spoke of Eastern sophistication. Her dress was expensive but understated, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room. "And this must be the famous Caleb," she said when Judge Harrison introduced us, her grey eyes studying me with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "I've heard quite a lot about you." "Nothing too scandalous, I hope," I replied, with the carefully modulated charm I had perfected over the past months. She laughed, a genuine sound that was neither calculating nor predatory. "On the contrary, I've heard that you're remarkably well educated for someone in your circumstances. That's quite rare in these parts." There was something in her tone that put me on alert. Unlike the other women who had tried to use me, Evangeline seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, rather than as an object to be possessed or manipulated. "I've been fortunate in my opportunities to learn," I said carefully. "Indeed." She paused, then added, "I wonder if you might be interested in helping me with a small project. I'm establishing a library at the academy, and I could use someone with your particular skills to help me organize it." The offer was unexpected and potentially dangerous. Working closely with Evangeline would give me access to information and influence, but it would also expose me to scrutiny from someone far more perceptive than my previous targets. "I would be honored to assist you, Mrs. Hartwell," I said, "though I would need permission from my current employers." "Of course. I'll speak with them directly." Over the following weeks, I found myself spending several hours each day at the Magnolia Academy, helping Evangeline organize her extensive collection of books and educational materials. The work was genuinely enjoyable. She had acquired texts on philosophy, literature, science, and politics that I had never had the opportunity to read before. But more importantly, I began to understand the true scope of Evangeline's ambitions. She wasn't just establishing a school for young ladies, she was creating a network of influence that would extend throughout the South. Her students would become the wives and daughters of powerful men, and through them, she would shape the political and social landscape for generations to come. It was during our third week working together that I discovered her secret. I was cataloging a shipment of books that had arrived from Boston when I noticed that several of the crates contained more than just educational materials. Hidden beneath layers of textbooks were weapons, rifles, pistols, and ammunition, along with detailed maps of local plantations and correspondence with known abolitionists. Evangeline Hartwell, respected educator and pillar of society, was running guns to slave rebellions. "I see you've discovered my little side business," she said calmly from behind me. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Hartwell, please call me Evangeline. And don't look so shocked. Did you really think someone with my background and beliefs would limit herself to teaching young ladies how to embroider?" I carefully set down the rifle I'd been examining. "What exactly are you asking of me?" She moved closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm not asking anything, Caleb. I'm offering you something that no one else can, a chance to strike back at the system that has enslaved you." The proposition was seductive in ways that the others hadn't been. Victoria and Eleanor had offered me comfort and status within the existing system. Evangeline was offering me a chance to destroy that system entirely. "And what would you want in return?" I asked. "Your help. Your knowledge of local plantation security, patrol schedules, the personalities and weaknesses of the men who own human beings like livestock." She paused, then added, "And your absolute loyalty." It was the last part that concerned me. I had learned to be wary of anyone who demanded loyalty, especially when they offered freedom in return. "I need time to consider your offer," I said. "Of course, but don't take too long. There are events in motion that won't wait for your decision." And over the next few days, I carefully investigated Evangeline's operation. What I discovered was both impressive and terrifying. She had been using her position as an educator to recruit sympathizers throughout the region, creating a network of safe houses and supply routes that stretched from New Orleans to Virginia. Her students' families, unknowingly, were funding the very rebellion that would destroy their way of life. But I also discovered something else. Evangeline's operation was being watched. Federal agents had been tracking weapons shipments from Boston, and they were closing in on her network. She had perhaps weeks before everything collapsed around her. The question was whether I should warn her or use this information to my advantage. The answer came when I overheard a conversation between Evangeline and one of her contacts, a free black man named Samuel who served as a courier for the Underground Railroad. "The boy is perfect for our needs," Evangeline was saying. "His access to the plantation houses, his ability to move freely among the elite, he could provide intelligence that would save dozens of lives." "And if he refuses?" Samuel asked. "Then he becomes a liability that needs to be eliminated," Evangeline replied coldly. "I've worked too hard building this network to let one person destroy it." In that moment, I realized that Evangeline Hartwell was no different from the others. She saw me as a tool to be used, and like all tools, I would be discarded when I was no longer useful. But unlike the previous women, Evangeline's downfall would require more than social manipulation. She was too intelligent, too careful, and too dangerous to be destroyed by gossip and scandal. I would need to be more creative. The opportunity came when I learned that a federal agent named Captain Morrison was planning to raid the academy within the week. Instead of warning Evangeline, I decided to accelerate the timeline. I began leaving carefully crafted evidence where the authorities would find it. A map of plantation defenses accidentally dropped near the courthouse. A letter discussing weapon shipments mistakenly delivered to the wrong address. Each piece of evidence was designed to lead investigators directly to Evangeline's operation. But I also made sure that the evidence would implicate her in ways that went beyond simple gun running. I forged documents suggesting that she had been embezzling funds from wealthy families to finance her activities, and I planted evidence indicating that she had been using her position to seduce and blackmail prominent men. The raid came on a Tuesday morning while Evangeline was teaching a class on literature to a group of young ladies from the finest families in the county. Federal agents surrounded the academy and discovered not only the weapons cache, but also the forged evidence that painted Evangeline as a criminal mastermind who had been using her students' families to fund a massive conspiracy. The scandal was enormous. Not only was Evangeline arrested for treason and gun running, but the revelation that she had supposedly been manipulating and blackmailing the region's elite families destroyed the reputations of several prominent men who had supported her academy. As I watched her being led away in chains, Evangeline caught my eye through the window of the federal wagon. For just a moment, her mask of composed dignity slipped, and I saw recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly who had orchestrated her downfall, but it was too late. By evening, the story was spreading throughout Mississippi like wildfire. The respected educator who had promised to civilize Southern society had been revealed as a dangerous radical who had betrayed the trust of everyone who had supported her. 3 down, 4 to go. But as I returned to my duties at Arbordale that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game was changing. The remaining women would be more cautious now, more aware of the danger I represented. They would be harder to manipulate and far more likely to strike first. The myth of Caleb was becoming a legend, but legends, I was beginning to understand, often came with a price that was higher than anyone expected to pay. Winter settled over Mississippi like a shroud, and with it came a new level of caution among the remaining elite families. Word of Evangeline Hartwell's spectacular downfall had spread through the social circles like wildfire, and suddenly everyone was looking at me with a mixture of fascination and fear. The beautiful slave, who had somehow been present at the destruction of 3 powerful women, was no longer just a curiosity. I was becoming a legend. But legends, as I was about to learn, attract the attention of those who believe themselves capable of controlling them. Miss Margaret Harrison, the 28-year-old daughter of Judge Harrison, was not like the other women I had faced. Where Victoria and Eleanor had been driven by social ambition, and Evangeline by ideological fervor, Margaret was motivated by something far more dangerous, the absolute certainty that she was smarter than everyone around her. She had never married, despite numerous proposals from suitable gentlemen, preferring instead to remain in her father's house where she could exercise real power behind the scenes. Judge Harrison might wear the robes and sit on the bench, but everyone in the county knew that Margaret was the one who truly controlled the Harrison family's considerable influence. I first realized I was in her crosshairs during a dinner party at the Harrison mansion in early December. I was serving wine when she addressed me directly, something she had never done before. "Caleb," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "I've been hearing the most interesting stories about you lately." The conversation at the table stopped abruptly. Judge Harrison looked uncomfortable, while the other guests leaned forward with barely concealed interest. "I hope they've been favorable stories, Miss Harrison," I replied carefully. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, quite favorable. It seems you have a remarkable talent for, shall we say, being in the right place at the right time." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Margaret Harrison was publicly acknowledging what many had begun to suspect privately, that I was somehow connected to the recent scandals that had destroyed several prominent women. "I've always believed that fortune favors the observant," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Indeed." And she took a sip of wine, never breaking eye contact. "And I imagine someone as observant as you must have noticed quite a lot during your various assignments." It was a warning disguised as conversation, and I understood it perfectly. Margaret Harrison was letting me know that she was aware of my activities and that she considered herself capable of handling whatever threat I might represent. Over the following weeks, I found myself under increasingly close scrutiny. Margaret began requesting my services for various tasks around the Harrison household, always with the excuse that she needed someone reliable and discreet. But I could feel her watching me, studying my every move and reaction. The real test came when she asked me to help her organize her father's private study, a room that contained sensitive legal documents and correspondence related to his judicial duties. "I trust you understand the confidential nature of these materials," she said, as we worked together one afternoon, sorting through files and legal briefs. "Of course, Miss Harrison. I would never presume to read documents that weren't meant for my eyes." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Caleb, we both know that's not true. You've built quite a reputation on reading things that weren't meant for your eyes." I continued organizing files, keeping my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, don't you?" She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else, something that reminded me of steel and winter mornings. "Let me be more direct. I know what you did to Constance Whitmore. I know how you manipulated Victoria and Eleanor into destroying each other, and I know that you were the one who provided the evidence that brought down Evangeline Hartwell." The accusation hung in the air between us like a blade. I could deny it, but Margaret Harrison was too intelligent to be fooled by protestations of innocence. "And what do you intend to do with this theory of yours?" I asked. "That depends entirely on you." She returned to her work, but I could sense the tension in her movements. "You see, I have a proposition for you." One that I think you'll find quite attractive. I'm listening. My father is getting old, and his memory isn't what it once was. He's been making errors in judgment lately. Errors that could prove embarrassing to our family if they became public knowledge. She paused, then looked directly at me. I need someone with your particular skills to help me manage these situations. Someone who understands the value of discretion and the importance of loyalty. It was the same offer that all the others had made, dressed up in different words. Margaret Harrison wanted to use me as a weapon against her enemies, just as Constance and Victoria and Evangeline had tried to do. But there was something different about Margaret's approach. She wasn't trying to seduce me or manipulate me through false promises of freedom. She was offering me a straightforward business arrangement, my skills in exchange for her protection. "And what would happen if I declined your generous offer?" I asked. Her smile was sharp as a razor. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, I have evidence linking you to several serious crimes. Theft, fraud, conspiracy. The list is quite extensive. It would be a shame if that evidence found its way to the wrong people." There it was, the threat that had been lurking beneath her polite words. Margaret Harrison had done her homework, and she believed she had me trapped. But what she didn't know was that I had been doing my own research. Judge Harrison's errors in judgment weren't the result of age or failing memory. They were the result of deliberate corruption orchestrated by his daughter. Margaret had been using her father's position to manipulate court decisions, selling favorable rulings to the highest bidder and using the proceeds to fund her own political ambitions. More damaging still, she had been blackmailing several prominent men with evidence of their extramarital affairs and business improprieties. Her files contained enough scandalous information to destroy half the political establishment of Mississippi. But the most interesting discovery was a series of letters between Margaret and a lawyer in Washington, D.C., discussing her plans to have her father declared mentally incompetent so that she could take control of his estate and judicial connections. Margaret Harrison had made the same mistake as all the others. She had underestimated me. "Your offer is certainly interesting," I said carefully, "but I think I need some time to consider it." "Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come along often." That evening, I began implementing my plan. Unlike the previous women, Margaret's downfall would require a more subtle approach. She was too well connected and too careful to be brought down by simple scandal. I started by making copies of the most damaging documents from her files, using my access to her father's study to gather evidence of her corruption and blackmail schemes. Then I began a careful campaign to expose her activities to the very people she had been manipulating. The breakthrough came when I discovered that one of Margaret's blackmail victims was Senator Pemberton, Eleanor's father. Despite his daughter's disgrace, he still wielded considerable political influence, and he had been quietly building a case against the Harrison family for months. I arranged for copies of Margaret's files to find their way to Senator Pemberton, along with evidence of her plans to have her father declared incompetent. The senator, seeing an opportunity for revenge against the family that had contributed to his daughter's downfall, immediately began sharing the information with other victims of Margaret's schemes. The scandal broke just before Christmas, when a coalition of Margaret's former blackmail victims filed formal charges against both her and her father. The evidence was overwhelming: corruption, extortion, conspiracy, and abuse of judicial authority. Judge Harrison, faced with the revelation of his daughter's crimes and his own unwitting complicity, suffered what appeared to be a genuine mental breakdown. He was quietly removed from the bench and committed to a private sanitarium, while Margaret was arrested and charged with multiple felonies. As I watched her being led away in chains, Margaret Harrison turned to look at me one final time. Unlike Evangeline, There was no surprise in her eyes, only a cold acknowledgement that she had been outplayed by a superior opponent. "Well done," she said quietly as she passed me. "I underestimated you." "Yes," I replied, "you did." 4 down, 3 to go. But as winter deepened and the news of Margaret Harrison's arrest spread throughout the region, I began to sense a change in the atmosphere around me. The remaining elite families were no longer just cautious. They were actively afraid. The beautiful slave who had somehow brought down 4 of the most powerful women in Mississippi was no longer a curiosity or a potential asset. I was becoming something far more dangerous, a symbol of the possibility that the established order could be challenged and defeated. The final phase of my campaign would be the most dangerous yet, because the remaining women would no longer underestimate me. They would come at me with everything they had, and only one side would survive the encounter. The myth was becoming reality, and reality, I was beginning to understand, was far more terrifying than any legend. The spring of 1845 arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to settle over the entire county like morning fog. Word of Margaret Harrison's imprisonment had spread far beyond Mississippi, and suddenly I found myself at the center of whispered conversations and fearful glances wherever I went. The beautiful slave who had somehow orchestrated the downfall of 4 powerful women was no longer just a local curiosity. I had become a symbol of something that terrified the Southern elite more than any external threat, the possibility that their own system could be turned against them. But if I had learned anything from my previous encounters, it was that cornered predators are always the most dangerous. The 3 remaining women, Mrs. Catherine Beauregard, Mrs. Lillian Montrose, and Miss Sophia Caldwell, had done something that none of their predecessors had managed. They had put aside their personal rivalries and formed an alliance specifically designed to destroy me. Catherine Beauregard, the judge's sister-in-law and a widow in her 40s, controlled the largest network of social connections in 3 counties. Lillian Montrose, wife of a wealthy plantation owner, had access to private investigators and mercenaries through her husband's business dealings. And Sophia Caldwell, barely 25 but already known for her ruthless intelligence, had inherited her late father's shipping empire and the political connections that came with it. Individually, each woman would have been a formidable opponent. Together, they represented a level of coordinated power that I had never faced before. I first became aware of their alliance during a seemingly innocent encounter at the Montrose plantation in early March. I had been sent to deliver a message from Master Whitmore when I noticed all 3 women gathered in the garden, their heads bent together in intense conversation. "Ah, Caleb!" Mrs. Montrose called out when she spotted me. "How convenient! We were just discussing you." The tone of her voice made my blood run cold, but I maintained my composure as I approached. "I hope the discussion was favorable, ma'am." "Oh, quite the opposite," Sophia Caldwell said with a smile that could have frozen water. "We've been comparing notes about your activities over the past year." Catherine Beauregard nodded gravely. "It's remarkable how many unfortunate incidents have occurred around you, young man. One might almost think you were cursed." "Or cursed," Lillian Montrose added meaningfully. I understood immediately what was happening. These women had done what none of the others had thought to do. They had investigated my role in the previous scandals and connected the dots. More importantly, they had decided to work together rather than compete against each other for control over me. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," I said carefully. "Of course you don't," Sophia replied. "But perhaps you'd be interested to know that we've been conducting our own investigation into recent events. We've discovered some very interesting patterns. Over the next few minutes, they laid out their case with the precision of prosecutors presenting evidence to a jury. They had traced my movements during each of the previous scandals, identified the specific information that had led to each woman's downfall, and even uncovered some of the methods I had used to gather and disseminate damaging intelligence. "The question," Catherine said when they had finished their presentation, "is what we should do with this information." "We could turn you over to the authorities," Lillian suggested. "I'm sure they would be very interested in hearing about your activities." "Or we could handle this matter privately," Sophia added. "There are many ways for a slave to meet with an unfortunate accident." But it was Catherine who delivered the real threat. "Or," she said quietly, "you could agree to work for us. Use your talents in service of our interests rather than against them." It was the same proposition that all the others had made, but with a crucial difference. This time, I was being offered the choice between cooperation and death. "What exactly would you want me to do?" I asked. "Nothing too demanding," Sophia replied. "Just use your access to various households to gather information that might be useful to us. Think of it as intelligence gathering. And in return, you continue breathing," Lillian said bluntly. "And perhaps, if you prove sufficiently useful, we might even arrange for your freedom when the time is right." I pretended to consider their offer, while my mind raced through possible responses. These women had clearly learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They weren't trying to seduce me or manipulate me through false promises. They were offering me a straightforward choice between submission and destruction. But they had also made a crucial error. They had revealed their hand too early. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course," Catherine replied, "but don't take too long. We're not known for our patience." As I left the Montrose plantation that afternoon, I knew that I was facing the greatest challenge of my life. These three women had resources, connections, and a level of coordination that made them far more dangerous than any individual opponent I had faced before. But they had also given me something invaluable: knowledge of their alliance and their intentions. Over the next few weeks, I began my most careful investigation yet. I studied each woman's strengths and weaknesses, mapped their connections and dependencies, and looked for the fault lines that might allow me to turn their alliance against itself. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Catherine Beauregard's social network was indeed extensive, but it was built on a foundation of carefully maintained secrets and mutual blackmail. She knew where all the bodies were buried, but that also meant that many powerful people had reasons to want her silenced. Lillian Montrose's access to private investigators and mercenaries came through her husband's involvement in illegal activities, smuggling primarily, but also some darker enterprises that would destroy him if they became public knowledge. And Sophia Caldwell's shipping empire was built on contracts with northern abolitionists who were using her vessels to transport escaped slaves to freedom. The irony was delicious. The woman who wanted to destroy me for threatening the slave system was secretly profiting from that system's destruction. But more importantly, I discovered that their alliance was not as solid as it appeared. Each woman was using the partnership to pursue her own agenda, and there were already signs of tension beneath the surface. Catherine resented Sophia's youth and ambition. Lillian was suspicious of Catherine's extensive knowledge of everyone's secrets, and Sophia clearly viewed the other two as temporary allies who would eventually need to be eliminated. The key to destroying their alliance lay in exploiting these existing tensions while making each woman believe that the others were betraying her. I began by planting carefully crafted evidence that suggested Catherine was secretly negotiating with federal authorities to expose Lillian's husband's smuggling operation in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her own crimes. Simultaneously, I arranged for Lillian to discover forged documents indicating that Sophia was planning to use information gathered through their alliance to destroy both of her partners and seize control of their assets. And I made sure that Sophia found evidence suggesting that Catherine and Lillian were planning to frame her for the illegal activities they had all been involved in. The beauty of the plan was that each piece of evidence contained just enough truth to be believable. Catherine did have extensive knowledge of criminal activities that could be used to bargain with authorities. Sophia was ambitious enough to betray her allies if it served her purposes. And Lillian was paranoid enough to believe that the others were plotting against her. The alliance began to fracture within days of my campaign beginning. Suspicious glances replaced friendly conversations. Private meetings became exercises in mutual surveillance. And each woman began taking steps to protect herself from the others. The final blow came when I arranged for all three women to discover simultaneously that their allies had been secretly investigating them. The revelation that each woman had been gathering evidence against the others while publicly maintaining their partnership destroyed any remaining trust between them. The confrontation took place at Catherine Beauregard's mansion during what was supposed to be a strategy meeting to finalize their plans for dealing with me. Instead, it became a three-way accusation session that quickly escalated into open warfare. By the time the evening was over, Catherine had exposed Lillian's husband's criminal activities to federal authorities. Lillian had revealed Sophia's abolitionist connections to local slave catchers, and Sophia had provided evidence of Catherine's blackmail schemes to her victims. Within a week, all three women were facing criminal charges, social ostracism, or both. Their alliance had not only failed to destroy me, it had become the instrument of their own mutual destruction. As I watched the aftermath of their spectacular mutual destruction unfold, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that I had never experienced before. The three most dangerous women in Mississippi had fallen not because I had outmaneuvered them individually, but because I had turned their own alliance into a weapon against itself. Catherine Beauregard fled to Charleston in disgrace after her blackmail victims united to destroy her socially and financially. Lillian Montrose's husband was arrested by federal agents, and she was forced to sell their plantation to pay his legal fees. Sophia Caldwell's shipping empire collapsed when her abolitionist connections were exposed, and she disappeared entirely. Some said to Boston, others to Europe. But as I stood in the ruins of their conspiracy, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The game that had begun with Constance Whitmore's attempt to use me as a political pawn had evolved into something far larger and more dangerous than I had ever intended. I was no longer just a slave seeking freedom through the destruction of his oppressors. I had become a symbol of the possibility that the entire system of Southern society could be challenged and defeated by those it sought to control. The remaining elite families were no longer just afraid of me personally. They were terrified of what I represented, and terror, I was beginning to understand, was a force that could either paralyze or galvanize, depending on how it was channeled. 7 down. But the real battle was just beginning. The myth of Caleb had become a legend, and legends, as I was about to discover, have a way of taking on lives of their own that even their creators cannot control. The stage was set for the final act of this deadly drama, and I could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on me like the humid Mississippi air before a storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that freedom might actually be within my grasp. The beautiful slave boy who had seduced and eliminated 8 powerful women was about to become something even more dangerous, a free man with nothing left to lose. The summer of 1845 arrived like a fever dream, thick with humidity and heavy with the weight of unfinished business. 7 of the most powerful women in Mississippi lay in ruins behind me, their lives destroyed by their own ambitions and my careful manipulations. But as I stood on the precipice of what I had always believed would be my moment of triumph, I discovered that victory was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. The eighth woman had been there all along, watching from the shadows while I systematically dismantled her competition. Mrs. Abigail Thornfield, the 60-year-old matriarch of the wealthiest family in 3 states, had been playing a game so subtle and long-term that I had never even realized I was a piece on her board. The revelation came on a sweltering July morning when I was summoned to the Thornfield estate, a mansion so grand it made every other plantation house in the region look like a cottage by comparison. I had never been inside before, despite the Thornfield family's prominence, and I should have wondered why. Mrs. Thornfield received me in her private study, a room lined with books and filled with the kind of quiet authority that comes from generations of accumulated power. She was smaller than I had expected, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. "Sit down, Caleb," she said without preamble. "We have much to discuss." I remained standing, every instinct telling me that I was walking into a trap. "I prefer to stand, Mom." She smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely afraid. "Of course you do. You've spent so long being the hunter that you've forgotten what it feels like to be prey." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens. "You've done remarkable work this past year, destroying my competition with such elegant precision. Constance Whitmore, Victoria Ashford, Eleanor Pemberton, Evangeline Hartwell, Margaret Harrison, Catherine Beauregard, Lillian Montrose, Sophia Caldwell, all of them gone, their power broken, their influence scattered to the winds." My blood turned to ice as I realized what she was saying. You orchestrated this." "Orchestrated is too strong a word. Let's say I facilitated certain opportunities." She turned back to face me, her expression serene. "You see, Caleb, those women were obstacles to my own plans. They controlled resources and connections that I needed, but they were too entrenched, too careful, too well protected for me to move against them directly. So you used me. I provided you with opportunities to use yourself. There's a difference." She returned to her desk and opened a leather portfolio. "Every piece of information you discovered, every secret you exploited, every weakness you identified, all of it came from intelligence that I made available to you through carefully orchestrated circumstances." The scope of her manipulation was staggering. She had been playing a game that spanned years, positioning me as her unwitting weapon, while I believed I was acting independently. "The letter from the Bank of New Orleans that you found in Constance's study, I made sure it was left where you would see it. The information about Victoria and Eleanor's past rivalry, I arranged for you to overhear that conversation. Evangeline's weapons cache, I provided the tip that led federal agents to investigate her in the first place." Each revelation was like a knife twisting in my chest. Everything I had accomplished, every victory I had claimed, had been part of someone else's larger design. "But why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I needed those women eliminated, and you were the perfect instrument for the task. Beautiful enough to attract their attention, intelligent enough to exploit their weaknesses, and desperate enough to take the risks necessary to destroy them." She paused, then added, "And expendable enough that your eventual fate wouldn't matter to anyone who could cause me problems." "Eventual fate?" Her smile was cold as winter morning. "Did you really think I would allow you to live after you had served your purpose? You know too much. You've seen too much, and you represent too great a threat to the new order I'm establishing." I felt the walls closing in around me as I realized the true scope of my situation. I had been so focused on my individual battles that I had never seen the larger war being fought around me. "However," Mrs. Thornfield continued, "I'm not entirely without mercy. I'm prepared to offer you a choice." "What kind of choice?" You can die here, today, quietly and without fuss. My men are positioned throughout the house, and your body will never be found. Or," she paused dramatically, "you can accept a different kind of servitude. I have operations in Cuba that require someone with your particular skills. You would be well treated, well compensated, and most importantly, alive." It was the same choice that had been offered to me repeatedly over the past year, dressed up in different words, submission or death. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of Mrs. Thornfield's trap closing around me, I realized something that she had not anticipated. In teaching me to be a weapon, she had also taught me to think like one. "Before I give you my answer," I said carefully, "I'm curious about something. How did you know that I would be able to destroy those women? What made you so confident that your plan would work?" She looked pleased by the question, as if she had been waiting for someone to appreciate the elegance of her strategy. "Because I understood something that they never did. You weren't just a beautiful slave seeking freedom. You were a predator who had been caged for so long that you had forgotten your own nature. All I had to do was provide you with prey and step back to watch you hunt. And you never considered the possibility that the predator might turn on its handler." Her expression shifted slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "What do you mean?" "I mean that while you were manipulating me, I was learning from you, watching how you operated, studying your methods, understanding your weaknesses." I took a step closer to her desk. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice that every piece of information I discovered was just a little too convenient, a little too perfectly timed?" The truth was that I had begun to suspect Mrs. Thornfield's involvement months ago, but I had allowed her to believe that I was still her unwitting pawn, while I conducted my own investigation into her activities. What I had discovered was that Abigail Thornfield's power was built on a foundation even more corrupt than anything I had uncovered about the other women. She had been systematically acquiring the assets of financially distressed plantation families through a combination of predatory lending and strategic blackmail. Her ultimate goal was to consolidate control over the entire cotton trade in the region, creating a monopoly that would make her the most powerful person in the South. But more importantly, I had discovered that her operations were entirely dependent on a network of forged documents and fraudulent contracts that could be exposed with the right evidence. "You see, Mrs. Thornfield," I continued, "while you were teaching me to be a weapon, you forgot that weapons can be turned against their creators." I reached into my jacket and withdrew a packet of documents that I had been carrying for weeks, waiting for this moment. "These are copies of your real financial records, the ones you keep hidden behind your legitimate business dealings. They show how you've been systematically destroying families and stealing their property through fraud and manipulation." Her face went pale as she recognized the documents. "Where did you get those?" "From your own files. You made one crucial mistake in your manipulation of me. You gave me access to information and resources that allowed me to investigate you just as thoroughly as I had investigated your targets." I placed the documents on her desk, spreading them out so she could see the full scope of what I had uncovered. "I've already arranged for copies to be delivered to federal authorities, newspaper editors, and several of your victims' families. By tomorrow morning, your empire will be under investigation by every law enforcement agency in the region." For the first time since I had entered the room, Mrs. Thornfield looked genuinely afraid. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you destroy me, you'll bring down half the political establishment of Mississippi with me. I'm counting on it." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of horses approaching the mansion at high speed. "Mrs. Thornfield moved to the window, and her face went white as she saw federal agents surrounding her property. "You see," I said quietly, "I learned something important from watching you operate. The most effective way to destroy an enemy is to make them destroy themselves. All I had to do was provide the right information to the right people and let justice take its course." As the federal agents entered the house, I walked to the window and looked out at the chaos unfolding in the courtyard. Mrs. Thornfield's men were being arrested, her records were being seized, and her carefully constructed empire was collapsing around her. "How?" she whispered. "The same way you taught me to destroy the others. I found your weaknesses, exploited your secrets, and turned your own methods against you." I turned back to face her as the agents reached the study door. "The difference is that I never underestimated my opponent." As Mrs. Abigail Thornfield was led away in chains, she looked back at me one final time. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've unleashed. Without the structure we provided, this entire region will descend into chaos." "Maybe," I replied, "but it will be honest chaos, not the corrupt order you were trying to create." The federal agents asked me to remain available for questioning, but they made it clear that I was considered a witness rather than a suspect. The evidence I had provided was so comprehensive and damning that Mrs. Thornfield's guilt was beyond question. As the sun set over the Thornfield estate that evening, I stood alone in the garden, where I had spent so many months planning and scheming. 8 of the most powerful women in Mississippi had fallen, their empire of corruption and manipulation finally brought to an end. But more importantly, I was free. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Mrs. Thornfield's fraudulent activities had been so extensive that dozens of families were able to reclaim property that had been stolen from them. The political corruption she had fostered was exposed and prosecuted, leading to a complete restructuring of power in the region. And I, the beautiful slave who had somehow orchestrated the downfall of the Southern elite, found myself in possession of something I had never dared to dream of: legal freedom and enough money from reward payments to start a new life wherever I chose. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of a ship bound for Boston, watching the Mississippi coastline disappear into the distance. The myth of Caleb had become a legend that would be told for generations, but the man behind the myth was finally free to become whoever he chose to be. The game was over, and for the first time in my life, I had won not just a battle, but the war itself. The beautiful slave boy who had seduced and eliminated 8 powerful women had become something even more dangerous than they had ever imagined. A free man who understood exactly how power worked and how it could be destroyed. And as the ship carried me toward a new life and new possibilities, I smiled at the thought that somewhere in the ruins of the old Mississippi elite, people were still whispering the name of Caleb, the slave who had brought down an empire with nothing but his beauty, his intelligence, and his absolute refusal to remain a victim. The legend would live forever, but the man was finally free to write his own story.